Hello everybody, welcome to another video of one of my chess league matches. In this game I was playing somebody who is around 2100 at their peak, and I believe they're still around 2090, so very good player. They don't have many games on databases, so that meant that I was unable to prepare for them because I have lots of games. They would be able to do the same, except actually be able to find matches of mine, so they could have prepared for me. Therefore, I chose to play a very unorthodox opening, which I very rarely play, if ever. Time limit was 60 minutes plus 15 seconds per move. I was black, they were white, and they started off e4, so I played knight c6, knight c3, and d6, because if I play e5, we've gone into a Vienna, which is fairly theoretical, and I prefer being the white side of the Vienna, to be honest. f4, so I can still play e5, but again, it's theoretical, so I played f5, which computers hate this move, and to be honest, I wasn't really a huge fan of it either, but I couldn't see anything like losing about this move. It just looked inferior to me. White apparently should play d4, and then after I take, there's a really cool move, d5, which prevents me from having a good knight. If they'd taken with their knight on e4, I'd have been fine. So here, apparently knight b4 is correct, and then white kicks me to the edge of the board, then finally captures on e4, and they have a clear edge according to the computers. I did not see this. I probably would have taken on e4, to be honest, if I had seen d4 in the game. But instead g3 was chosen, which makes it a bit more passive. It's a very safe move, but I'm not a huge fan of it because the bishop on f1 can already move. So I'm not sure fianchettoing it is entirely the right plan. It looks a bit slow. And I should have taken, but instead I played knight f6, with white covering e4 with the bishop. Then I thought maybe I could get the same position and go into a kind of symmetrical double Dutch, which is very unlikely for my opponent to know all the lines, and we would then just have to outplay each other. They took on f5, so I took with the bishop, and now I've got better development. The only problem I have is my e7 pawn is a bit weak. I need to push it up to e5 at some stage. But first, bishop g7, and we both are thinking about castling. His choice is easy. Mine, not so much. I wasn't sure whether to play queenside or kingside. And so I played queen d7 with the idea of maybe going bishop h3, but keeping my options open. And after d4, it pained me to play it, but I did castle kingside. Queenside is just too dangerous, with the white bishop on g2 pointing towards my kingside. Pointing on the queen side, but where my king would be positioned. Here white did still play d5, gaining space, and apparently knight b4 is correct, aiming at the d5 pawn. But I couldn't see a way I could take it, and even though I attack c2 with my bishop and my knight, I had thought knight d4 would give white a clear advantage. And it turns out this is still the best black has to offer. Instead, after d5, I played knight d8, trying to play e6 or e5, with my knight being able to capture on e6 if white were to take me there. Knight d4 was chosen, and I thought that I should still keep my two bishops with bishop g4, gaining time on the queen. And finally, I decided to try and relieve the weaknesses in my position with e5, gaining central control with the pawn. White traded the pawns, and I now have an interesting position where both of us have pawns in the centre of the board, where his d5 pawn normally would be a bit weaker, strangely enough, because it's being attacked by two of my pieces, and it's in my half, where it's more likely I'm able to aim at it and capture it. Whereas my e5 pawn is in my half. But in this case, their d5 pawn is a lot stronger than my one because it's being defended so much. And my one is isolated. There's never any pawn of mine that can defend my e5 pawn. And they can start to, block it up and then slowly come around and destroy the pawn with all their attackers. So I thought that perhaps I was a bit worse, but if I can maybe play a few moves to defend my pawn, I might be fine. It turns out knight c5 is strongest, trying to put their knight onto e4. in the near future, blockading my pawn. And if they take b7 here, it's a bit awkward for them, and for me really, but it's probably what they could have done. Instead, this move bishop e3, while it develops, I'm not really sure what it's doing, other than defending the c5 square, and potentially putting a bishop or a knight there. And b6, I didn't like the look of that, because it's a pawn move and doesn't really help my pieces to improve. So knight d6, knight c5, queen e7. And here we're fighting over the e4 square. I've got two knights on it, they've got a bishop, two knights and a queen. So they have so far winning the battle. Rook a to e1, lining up with my queen and my weak e-pawn. Very, very good move. I tried to counterattack with rook a d8, lining up with their pawn and their queen. And very nice move, bishop d4. Attacking the pawn, and if I take their bishop, my queen will drop. Here I thought that if I let the pawn go, or played a really defensive move like knight back to f7, I would clearly be worse. I played the only move I could think of, which was to gain time on the queen, and they played a really good move, continuing to pressure my pawn on e5. Here I pushed e4, trying to have enough defenders on it to trade loads of pieces, and then maybe, when we reach the ending, it might be the case that they're a pawn up, but perhaps they won't have enough to actually win if it's, say, a rook and pawn ending. And it turns out bishop f6 is strongest, with me recapturing, then they take on e4, and what will eventually happen, like I had sort of predicted or planned, was we get a lot of trading, and actually in this position I can simply take the pawn on d5, or I can even take the pawn on b2, and the game is surprisingly not that bad for me. White can still win the pawn, with bishop takes b7 coming up, but with opposite coloured bishops and double rook endings, it's surprisingly difficult to actually win this for either side. So I'm not too upset with this position. I can probably win the pawn back anyway if they take on b7 with the move bishop d4. And then when they move the king, I will trade the rooks on f4 and then take on b2, and the game will be equal. I didn't see this far, I won't lie. But my e4 move was right in principle. They took on the e4 straight away though, which is apparently a blunder. Because when I trade, their bishop on d4 is now being attacked. They have no real choice other than to play bishop takes g7, retaining the piece. I take back, and then they recapture with their knight. Although apparently the bishop is a little bit better for white. But I had planned to play rook to e8, and I'd missed white's counterpunch. Can you see the move for white, which keeps them in the game? Well done if you found it. Knight e6, interfering with my rook's attack on the bishop and pinning it to the queen. It turns out my best move is to sack the exchange, which I very much doubt I would have played, unless I'd have had a very long time to consider it. Once you see it on the board, it becomes obvious it was the best move, but I would have had to really, really look at it. And the reason it's good is that I get two pieces for the rook, and the e6 pawn is the key point of this. If I can win it, then I think I'm much better, but if I can't win the pawn, then I think white's much better. And it turns out here that I can force off the queens, and then winning the pawn is relatively easy. I will gang up on it with my king, knight and bishop, and it will drop fairly soon. But instead of that, in the game, white took with their knight on e4. I didn't take yet, but I lined up, pinning their knight to the queen, and there's no longer a piece on e6 which can disrupt the pin. White got out of the pin, but into another one, with my bishop lining up with their queen and their knight. And here it turns out bishop e4 is correct, but I took with the pawn. I took the pawn with the queen. Simply, getting an equal position in terms of material, but also an advantage in position and the general activity of the pieces. White tried to disrupt my pin with g4, but it's too late. bishop takes e4. Queen b6 is the best move, though, which I had not found in the game. But it's only a little bit better, to be honest. White took to disrupt my defense of the bishop. Very good move, because if I take with the rook, then they can take my bishop back without any trouble. And if I take with my king, then there's all these checks that can come in at me. So I did decide to take the rook with the rook. They took back, and then I came in with queen f6. And here, if you can find white's move to keep them in the game, then excellent. What is white's only move which gives them any chance? It's a great prophylactic move, king to h1, where a lot of my plans are disrupted and I don't have like a completely winning game. It's still very good for me, and I would prefer black here. But white definitely can still play on. In the game they played queen d2, which is a blunder. Can you see why? Black to play and win. It's a deflection tactic. Queen f1 check does not work because their rook would take my queen. But if their rook wasn't there, it would be checkmate. I played knight takes e4, and here white has to resign, as again the rook cannot leave the first rank. And otherwise I'm a piece up with the attack as well, so white doesn't even have any compensation for the piece. And this was the end of the game. Overall, not one of my better performances. I generally gave white a lot of the space and time and everything up until the middle game, and then I was left with a sort of bad enough position that I had to risk a lot in terms of weakening my pawns and allowing the white pieces to dominate the center for a while. And then I don't want to say got lucky, but I definitely had to complicate and go into a position which I didn't fully understand, and then fortunately for me they were the ones who blundered first. But still, a win's a win, and if you're interested at all, my win when the game ended meant our team was ahead 2-0, and that also meant that our remaining teammates who were still playing their matches were able to play on without any risk of losing the match, because the worst that could happen is the game would be tied 2-2. And I think our board 3 won their game, and so we ended up winning the match 3, and I think it was 3.5 to a half, but it might have been 3-1. Either way, good result, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.